Yeah.
I think I actually only ended up seeing that.
Well,
I
so
have.
we're the channel is live, so
Oh, hey.
that's all right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I'm Christiana Ellis,
And I'm Mike Mateen.
and we are here to update our progress on our 2025 Oscar movie marathon. We're going to talk about some of the movies that we have now both seen, as well as update our progress generally. And as you were just saying when the stream kind of started in media res, um, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. Only that the stream was starting.
No, it's fine. I mean, we still have plenty to talk about still,
Mm-hmm.
but thing new that I've seen is the substance. It's just been this first couple weeks, just with the golf tournament here and
Mm-hmm.
everything. It's tricky,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I have a lot of things queued up
Well,
and
that's
planned.
good. Uh, I made a fair amount of progress numerically, even though it's really just a handful of movies. Just that I kind of knocked off all of the ones that had a bunch of nominations. And so that increases the percentage pretty substantially, even if it's relatively speaking, a smaller number of movies. So you've seen The Substance since our last update. I've now seen Honora, The Brutalist, A Complete Unknown, Emilia Perez, and Nickel Boys. Oh, and Flow. Flow. So, it's uh, over a couple of weeks, if you prioritize, like that's not necessarily a huge number of movies, but that took me all the way from something like 24% up to 75%.
Yep.
Just those movies. Now, that said, increasing the percentage from here, not nearly so easy because now the movie with the next highest number of nominations that I haven't seen yet only has 3 nominations. So,
Yes. So I
uh,
can make up the ground.
yes. Well, it's just that my progress was front loaded. But yes, so that still means though that I can maybe just very briefly, like one sentence encapsulation of the ones that we're not going to get into, and then we will get into a more deep discussion, including spoilers for some of the ones that we've both seen. And I was going to propose that maybe we do those in release order, just because those are maybe that's the order that people might have already seen them in.
I mean, if you have that handy.
I do. I
Okay.
just I don't have to look it up. I know when they came out more or less. But in any case, uh, just to kind of touch on the other Best Picture nominees, uh, Honora is maybe considered in some circles the current frontrunner for winning Best Picture. I really liked it. I would not be unhappy for it to win. However, there's several of them that I would be okay with winning in this one. And this movie, just to give the very brief presentation of it, it starts with this young woman who is an exotic dancer, and a very wealthy young Russian man comes into the club one day and decides that he wants to hire her to be his live-in girlfriend for the week while he's in America. And things progress from there because they really hit it off, and it gets to the point where he proposes to her that they should get married so that he can get a green card and not have to go back to Russia. And it should be noted that the audience will have already understood that this is probably a very bad idea. Like, it's all very sweet, but these kids are kind of naive, and we as the audience can foresee problems. But I will say, though, from that point, which is about 45 minutes into the movie, I could not have predicted almost any turn that would happen in the rest of the movie. And I don't want to say it's not like it gets fantastical or something, like vampires don't show up or something. But the point is that it is an enormously surprising and entertaining movie throughout. Highly recommended.
Nice. Where's that available?
That one I rented it on streaming for $5.99.
Perfect.
The Brutalist still in theaters. Also very good, although like it's basically a drama that is meshing the sort of like some, classic immigrant story tropes with the stories about how do you try to make art when the very nature of your medium requires not only a lot of time but a lot of money and a patron, right? Like to just even do it at all requires those things. And so that means that in order to be an artist in that medium, you have to really be prepared to like what are you willing to compromise on, what are you not, what are you willing to sacrifice, what kind of single-minded focus do you need to have, and what other consequences of that might there be, right? And that's all overlaid with this immigrant story. And I will say it's not a twist ending, but there is a reveal at the end that is important and yet so underplayed. I would not be surprised if a lot of people literally miss it. Like they just don't realize the implications of what's being said. So I recommend the movie. I think it's good. It's long. It literally shows with an intermission in the theater. But if you think about what's being said at the ending if you go see it, because it matters. And then it has a cut to credits needle drop that literally made me laugh out loud. But I won't say more. A Complete Unknown we touched on last time when you had said that it was one you were looking forward to. I'll say it's pretty good. It's fairly high on the music biopic, tropes scale, meaning very little about the structure of the movie is going to be surprising to anyone who has seen music biopics before. It's literally directed by the same guy who did Walk the Line. So Johnny Cash is in it because he and Bob Dylan knew each other. But I think it's pretty good. I think it gets a little muddled towards the end, but certainly worth seeing. Emilia Perez, we're probably going to need to talk more about at some point. But what I'll say right now is the metaphor that came to mind is you go to a really fancy, highly recommended restaurant, and they serve a lot of different things, and some of them are pretty good, and some of them are weird. But then you get food poisoning at the end. And so it's like, it's not that there's not good things in there, but overall the whole thing is a pretty substantial thumbs down, do not recommend. I don't think it should win anything. I don't like it. It's bad.
I had heard that from others as well.
It's bad in a lot of complicated ways that are hard to kind of really detail without getting too deep into it. I can see why the people who like it do so. But I think that those people are able to ignore several things about it that I was not. And I'll leave it there. Okay. Nickel Boys. It is potentially could be seen as a gimmicky movie because it's shot in first person. Like the entire movie is from the first person perspective of these two guys, meaning like it'll switch back and forth between them. But it's in first person. And so that could be gimmicky, but it's extremely effective. It's really well used here. It's about these two young men who get involved in a juvenile detention facility in the 1960s. So another very, very good movie.
Nice.
And then I think Flow is the last of these ones that I'll just touch on. It is I think, entirely dialogue-free animated movie about animals having to survive a flood, basically. But the animals, despite not talking and not being really anthropomorphized in the traditional, like, talking animals cartoon sense, definitely have characterization to them and arcs and plot and so on, even if it's dialogue free. But it's very nice. It's good. People should watch it. Okay. So, with those sort of initial capsule reviews out of the way, let's jump into the movie that has been out the longest of the ones that we've now both seen, and that would be Dune Part 2. Since I've just been talking a lot, you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah. I mean, so it kind of took me a while. It took me until this movie came out to really go back and watch the original Dune.
You mean Part 1 of this?
Yeah, part one. Not the original. No, sorry. Yes, part one of this setup, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was still good. There's so much exposition in it. So I think that's probably some of the stuff I might have talked about, last year, or the year before, whenever it came out, when we watched it. But it was cool to go back and watch it knowing that you were going to kind of get to see the next part, right? Because Abby hadn't seen it, my wife hadn't seen it, so we sat and watched it, and it's still beautiful, it's still interesting, but it was nice to know that we were going to get to go into this. And then this movie is phenomenal and leaves you really, really wanting the next one. So, I mean, there's not too much to say about it that's much different, other than like it's stunningly visual. It's visually stunning. It's very well made. Has a lot more action in it. Timothée Chalamet like takes it to another level. I mean, I think the fact that he gave an entire like motivational speech in a made up language, and you feel the motivation to the point where it's actually become a meme, where there's like new subtitles to it, like based on different things. Like, I think I might have told you, I don't know if we talked about it on here, but there was even one when they selected the teams, or were going into the selection of the teams for the college football playoff, that they had, him making the case for like who the teams should be, right? And like it works so well, because it's like it's just rousing in and of itself, and like that's a pretty dang good performance if you can convey that, because it's not just like what he's saying via the subtitles. Like, when you watch a movie in the native language, like the language has a certain flow to it. It was written a certain way. This is an invented language, right? And he's able to still make it kind of flow correctly and like rouse when it needs to. So that right there, I think, hands down, like made me say like, okay, this is a guy like if I was in this area, like I would follow this guy like he was the Messiah, like. So that's very cool. I think their treatment of the worm riding is pretty cool. It's fun. It looks cool. And it doesn't take away from the story, which has always been one of the challenges of making this series, is like that particular set of events, right? Is like, how do you make these things without them looking gimmicky and all that, because they're giant worms, right? And so I think the fact that they really delivered on that helped. So I really liked it. I don't know that it's best picture worthy, because it does kind of sit, in between, but it definitely makes you be like, I can't wait to see how this all comes together, right? And but I will step out and say, like, if they didn't take the story any further, like it is self-contained enough where like you don't necessarily feel like let down. You're excited for what's next. You're not like, oh, I'm not complete until I see what's next. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Have you read the books? Okay. So in a similar way, well, okay. Just to rewind too, because I think, like as you suggested, the context of what you think about Dune Part 1 of this particular movie franchise is relevant. And I'll say that although I am a big fan of Dune the property, going way back. I have read the book 3 times. First time was like in high school, and so like I've been a longtime fan of the story, right? Um, the first part, like part one of this series, honestly left me a little cold. Not that I thought it did anything wrong exactly, but one of the biggest issues with the book, in terms of why people thought for so long that it was unfilmable, was actually not down to the effects and trying to make sure that the effects would play, but rather because in the book, something like 70% of the page count is just people thinking. There's a whole lot of internal monologue in these books. And so that's very difficult to convey cinematically. And so it's also a big, long book. And so it's always been a challenge to say, well, how do you actually compress that story into a single movie? Well, in this case, they decided not to compress it into a single movie, but to do it into 2 instead. I think that's fine. But I think when I saw the first one, I thought it did a lot of things pretty well, but I found myself wanting to be surprised more. Because as I watched, it was more just kind of like, okay, well, there's that plot beat. And then this is going to happen. Yep, there it is. And then this happens, and this happens. And it did very well of portraying the plot, like the actual action of the story is presented in a way that makes it comprehensible and accessible for people who haven't read the book. And that is an accomplishment, for sure.
Yep.
But as someone who has read the book more than once, I was missing a lot of the context. Meaning, it's one thing to see an event happen on the screen, but I feel like in the book, though, there's so much detail of like, what is this character thinking when they go into this scene, and why did they do it, and here's why the history matters, and here's why it's such a big surprise when this guy shows up. And it's like you have all of this context that really makes it a very rich story in that regard. And it felt much more like simplified as a result. Now again, it's very clear that the reason for that is that it allows this incredibly complicated story to be told in a way that can be followed by people who have not read the book. So I can give it credit for that, even if I can sort of feel like, well, this movie is made for people who haven't read the book, not for me. That's kind of what my take for the first one was. It's like, I don't think it did anything wrong, but I didn't love it.
And I mean, for someone who hasn't read the book, like I said, like it looks great and you can understand what's happening, but it's just not engaging on that next level, right?
Now, part 2 had a leg up in that respect, because just from a plot level, it's the better half of the story, in my opinion. And a lot of people were a little bit worried because one of the things that's interesting about Dune, the story, is that it's very easy to even read the book version and come away thinking, well, yeah, Paul's the hero. And miss this whole element where, he's the hero in a very limited sense. But what he's doing is kicking off a war that's going to kill billions of people over hundreds of years. And he knows that.
So I'd be curious though, like, do you get the same kind of feeling when you read the book of like wanting to see what happens next? Like,
oh yeah, well, yes, and I'll touch briefly on the Dune Messiah, which is the sequel, which makes, in some ways, it takes the elements that could be easily overlooked with a surface read of the first book and makes them just like explicit text. Like, Dune Messiah might as well be in case you didn't get this part of the last book, right? And so I would be interested to see, how they take on that. For one, Dune Messiah is like a fourth the length of the first book. It's very short by comparison. It's almost like a coda that was just written later.
So are they gonna do it like a trilogy?
I
Like,
have no idea. I don't know. I mean, I've heard them like Denis Villeneuve has said, I guess, that he wants to make Dune Messiah, but I don't know anything else about how they would be
yeah.
planning to do it. But in some ways, it does kind of complete the thought in a way that it would be like, because the broad strokes of the plot of Dune parts 1 and 2 here are very easy to mistake for a conventional, like, I'm not even white savior. I'm not trying to get into that element of it, although there's some of that there, obviously. But the idea of Harkonnens are the bad guys, and obviously we've got these poor oppressed people. We're going to help them rise up and fight off the bad guys, and we win. Hooray! Right? It's very easy to see that in this story, but it's trying to do something more complex than that, which is this idea of what do you do if you're feeling a drive to do that, but know that it's going to lead to centuries of horror and bloodshed. And yet to also kind of feel like you don't have that much choice. Like, because you are essentially kind of a prisoner of everything that has come before you. And so it's doing a lot of interesting things. And so I kind of mention all of that just to say, I think I was pleasantly surprised with Dune Part 2 not just abandoning that element. Because I think it would be a more conventional cinematic choice to just kind of pretend that part is not in the story and to just go ahead and tell it like it's the simple version of we fought the bad guys and we won. Right? And so I was glad that they didn't, even though I think it's still probably true that a lot of people watching only on a surface level wouldn't really get any of that in there. I think that the one of the best things that the movie does in this regard is give us Zendaya, who's great, as Chani, gets a beefed up role in this. In order for her to take over as the audience surrogate. Once he changes, now we're seeing that change through her and understanding that he's different now. And to have some really ambivalent feelings about that.
Yeah, I agree.
And so I thought that was a really effective way of doing that part of the story. And so I'm kind of with you in the sense that I like it a lot more than part 1. I think it does a lot of things really well. It's got obviously some thrilling action sequences. The worms are cool. You know, there's the whole black and white fight on the Harkonnen planet is cool. There's lots of cool stuff in it. I think it's the better part of part 1 and part 2 for sure. But also, like, I mean, the only way it would win is just kind of purely it's the big spectacle one. But I think at this point, if the voters were wanting to award a big crowd pleaser spectacle, they're probably going to give it to Wicked instead. Right? You know,
Yeah.
which we'll talk about. But yeah, so I think it's good. I don't love it. You know, I think there's maybe just a secret part of me that the kid that read the whole Dune series in high school is probably never going to be entirely happy with any movie version of it. You know, so I'll acknowledge that I've got that baggage coming into it. I would, if they make Dune Messiah, I will certainly go to see it. Okay. So just to touch on what it's nominated for, it's obviously nominated for Best Picture. It has 5 nominations. So the other ones are kind of all of the more technical ones. It's got production design, cinematography, sound, and visual effects.
Yeah, and I would be curious if Timothy Chalamet would have had a shot had he not had the other movie, had he not had A Complete Unknown.
Yeah, Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, maybe.
It is hard also. I mean, as much as good as that was, it is
Hmm.
hard to win Best Actor delivering everything like in
Yeah.
the made up language,
Well,
not
it's
everything, but like yeah.
yeah, and it's certainly true that generally speaking, I think Oscar campaigns know better than to try to have someone compete against themselves in a category, even
Right.
if they did
That's more what
do.
I meant, like
Yeah,
campaign wise, like would they have put more behind it and would he have gotten it?
yeah, maybe. Yeah, I could potentially see that.
I
Um,
think he was really a part of it. And then to your point also, that not that I mean I haven't seen any of the others, but
yeah.
Zendaya was very good. So
Yeah, I love her. Although, I'm just going to take another moment to lament that my favorite movie of last year, Challengers, did not get a single nomination, which is an egregious snub, in my opinion. She should have been nominated for Challengers instead of for nothing.
yeah, I kind of heard that as well and was surprised that it got nothing. Um,
I loved it. I think I'm also not alone in a lot of people are felt like that was their favorite movie last year and just nothing. I don't get it. I mean, it
yeah,
came out early in the year, so maybe it was just kind of had fallen out of people's memories. Like the same director literally came out with a second movie the same year. So, I mean, it's like
it had some Golden Globe and all that, but
yeah, it's just but yeah, in any case, people should watch Challengers. It's very good. It was my favorite.
yes.
All right.
And I just to
Mm-hmm.
touch on this because I wanted to talk about it at some point. It'll be really quick. I won't
Sure.
spend
No,
much
go
time
ahead.
on it,
Yeah.
and I'm not nearly as passionate about it by any means. But like one that I was really hoping for, who had an outside chance, was Hugh Grant for Heretic.
Oh yeah.
I think he really did a good job. It's yeah. I mean, you kind of have to watch it, but like what it's trying to accomplish, like it only gets there because of him. Like he's kind of speaking this voice of like
Sure.
you watch it we can talk about it at
Yeah.
another time but it's
Mm-hmm.
he he's taking a very convolute like a very ridiculous plot that's trying to make and it's not even like trying to really make a point it's trying to show that there are multiple ways to look at this stuff
Mm-hmm.
but without his like very hammy but effective performance like then the
Mm-hmm.
movie's just kind of weird it's still weird but
Yeah.
it's much more interesting because of what he does and how kind
Mm-hmm.
of out of character it is for him. So anyway,
Yeah.
I'll
No,
pass.
that's fine. I haven't seen Heretic, but I have heard he's fun in it for sure.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people have particularly called out that he does a Jar Jar Binks impression at one point.
he does, and
Yes.
it works for
Yeah.
where it falls in the movie and what he's trying to do, right?
Sure.
And it's kind of it's not horror, but it's like more of the horror that I'm drawn to now,
Mm-hmm.
like that sort of psychological, which we'll get into the substance, which is much more like that
Mm-hmm.
too, So
Yeah.
I like those things. I like that there's more of that now.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
So now that you mentioned the substance is actually the one that came out next chronologically. So let's maybe go ahead and jump to that one. The substance really surprised me by getting way more nominations than I would have expected for the kind of movie that it is, which is not to say I didn't love it, but boy, it's not the movie I usually would expect to get a Best Picture nom. It got Best Picture nomination. It got Best Director nomination. Demi Moore as Best Actress nomination. Where else? The screenplay for Best Original Screenplay nomination. And I think there was maybe one more. Probably, yeah, Best Makeup and Hairstyling. Yeah, I think that's it. Um, but yes, I mean, yeah, so I guess I'll just kind of reiterate. I loved this movie. I had an enormously good time seeing it in the theater. I am shocked it got so many nominations. Not because I don't think it's that good. It's just the kind of movie that usually doesn't get this kind of recognition. Um, I think its nominations are earned. I'm just surprised that it got them. Um, so the basic premise, if people are not familiar, is that we have Demi Moore, who is an aging starlet. She seems to be most known either, if not most known for, then at least currently doing kind of like a fancy aerobics show, which is a little bit surprising just in the sense that it sort of implies that she's more famous than you would think for someone who's basically just doing an aerobics show.
The take I got on it was that that's all that she can get right now, right? Is
Yeah,
that like
I think
like
there's.
she was famous for something, and that's why
Mhm.
people watch this aerobics show, is because, oh, it's, hey, like,
Yeah.
as she's getting older, like she can still like
Hmm.
work out and keep her body, and you admired her when you were younger, and now you can do it too. Like
Right.
that's kind of the vibe I got
Yeah.
from it.
I think
Yeah, it didn't really
there's
say it.
definitely some of that for sure, but I also kind of had the impression that it wasn't necessarily meant to be taken literally, because we certainly don't see even any discussion at all of like other kinds of movies or even other kinds of TV shows. And I think in some ways the aerobics show was meant to be kind of a little bit of like just a stand-in for the entertainment industry writ large, in the sense that it's basically just about, we want a pretty lady to get in sexy positions on TV. And it's all about her
I think that's a
looking
good take
beautiful,
on it.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know that it's necessarily intended to suggest completely literal. Certainly, the movie is not going for grounded.
No.
No. And so, in any case, she is increasingly. I think she actually loses the job, right? Because she gets in a car accident, and they basically use that as an excuse to just dump her. But she then hears about this treatment or some of medicine or something called the substance, which has some very great creepy branding, and the whole way that you get it is kind of ridiculous and over the top. But the idea is that it promises a new you, but there's all these rules. It might as well be like Gremlins, right? Like there's, you have to follow the rules. But what it does, and like this is, minor spoiler if you haven't seen it at all, but it when she uses it, it essentially makes her molt her regular body sort of, and like birth a new, younger, hotter version of herself that her consciousness is in, while her original body is laying there unconscious on the floor. But the rule is she has to do 7 days on, 7 days off. Like she has to switch her mind back and forth between the older version and the younger version. And there's just sort of a general warning of like, that's the rule. You have to do it that way. But naturally, the human nature thing is she's so pleased to be young and hot, now played by Margaret Qualley. She doesn't want to switch back. So she keeps kind of trying to, like, can we squeeze a little more extra time? But then that starts having consequences. And it's a horror movie, so it just kind of develops from there. And
And I probably should have seen what ended up happening, not exactly like coming. I could have sworn that there was going to become a battle between the two of them. Like if you, as the older one,
mm-hmm.
stayed longer, then it would start to reverse things, but then impact the younger one.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was where they were going with it. That is not where they went with it.
Right. Well, what's fascinating, I think, about the duality of it is because, especially when we're seeing two different actresses, it's easy to really start to think of them as two different people. And psychologically, that's even happening to the character, right? As she is, when she's in the younger version of herself, she's disgusted by the older version of herself. But then when she's back in the older version of herself, she's like, oh, I can't believe the younger version of myself did this to me, right? But as the substance branding tried to emphasize to her, you are still just one person. Don't get it twisted and start blaming yourself in the other mode for anything when it's still you making all the decisions. But of course, I think what's fun about that is that it understands that that's probably a very human reaction to the scenario that they're in.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed the choice of while they are the same person, they don't necessarily like it's not like Freaky Friday, right? Like she
Mm-hmm.
doesn't bring all of the same, like it's her own psychology, but it almost still is kind of a
Mm-hmm.
it feels like a different person, right? Like so
Mm-hmm.
she can't rationally as she's younger say, stop doing this because you're hurting myself.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's just not there, right? And
Yeah.
they make that very clear through a very kind of fun like scene, right? Not fun scene, but it's not fun is a weird word for it. But the one of the earliest scenes is when she comes back and like she has to clean up after herself in the house, and that's where
Mm-hmm.
like what it's laying you there is like she doesn't know everything that she did, even though it was her, right?
Well, I feel like it's interesting. I think it plays with that a little bit. I mean, because there's really
Mhm.
no logical reason why they wouldn't. There isn't a continuity of memory. I think it's, but I think to some extent, part of it might be things like getting blackout drunk and then not remembering what you did, right? I mean, I think that's intended to be kind of the analog there. But it's certainly true that, for example, when she's in her older version of herself, she doesn't want to go out that way. And so she's depressed and bummed, and she's just like, like eating bad and making a mess because she's not taking care of herself because she's depressed, wanting to sit and, feeling jealous of herself from the other week, and then when she switches, she's like, all right, now I get to be me, but wait, now I have all this mess to clean up. Gosh, that older version of myself, she's such a slob. I hate her. Even though it's like, again, it's the same person. It's supposed to be, except I think that the movie's kind of asking, though, but is it, though? Like, to some extent, we kind of think of ourselves as our mind is who we are, and the body is just sort of the vehicle that we pilot around. But I think it's asking some questions about, like, well, but I mean, they really are inextricably linked, right? You can't really have one without the other. And so uh, it all go because it's a horror movie. It kind of starts going bad, which is predictable, but it goes perhaps worse than you might think. Um,
Yes.
I think that it is. I mean, I was really pleased with it. I had the final sequence. I won't say more other than to just say I had a huge big grin on my face watching that whole final sequence. It is not for the squeamish, I would say.
No.
Um, I, I I won't necessarily speak too much of it, but you had given me the impression that your wife had agreed to watch it as long as it wouldn't get too gross, and then it did.
Yes.
And boy, just the I think if it had been like in progress, it's like as long as it doesn't get too gross, I would say. I think it's gonna. It gets pretty
And
gross.
it does a good job of like warming you up to that too, though. Like
Mm-hmm.
even just the first time that she does the substance, like
Yeah.
it's a very direct, uncomfortable shot of like her drawing blood from herself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the blood transfusion is very graphic, again, not in a horror
Mm-hmm.
way, but just in a if this stuff if that makes you squeamish, you probably shouldn't stick around for the rest of
Oh
the
yeah,
movie.
yeah. It's a great build, but it very much is that genre. But I think also just the reason I think it has gotten the award nominations that it has is that in addition to just being sort of a clever concept for this, just all of the actual filming of conveying the two different versions of this character and also conveying the world and how obsessed with the male gaze it is. And you got Dennis Quaid playing an especially loathsome TV producer, right? And just incredible smoothness of how it conveys everything in just really effective, stylish, interesting ways. Um, and I think it's it's just an exceptionally well done example of its genre, which is you know what I mean. I can't help but wonder. I mean, Demi Moore is great in it, for sure. I don't think it's a bad thing that she got her nomination, but I almost feel like her being so good in it and Hollywood wanting to kind of say, yeah, yeah, she is really good in that. I wonder if that was kind of the foot in the door, so to speak, for it to get some of these other nominations.
Yeah,
Like it
I would
wouldn't have
say
got the attention otherwise.
I would say maybe the other thing with it is that so like again I told you that like hey as long as it doesn't get too weird or gross or whatever then I'll
Mm-hmm.
watch it and it does but she never stopped watching and this is the first time really ever like days later she's like I'm still like thinking about that movie and not the weird part right like
Mm-hmm.
what it earned before it delivered the weird part
Yeah.
right
Mm-hmm.
and like the actual concept it was playing with like somebody who doesn't like sit around and think about movies and talk about them like we do was still considering the themes and
Mm-hmm.
so it kind of transcended by using by being so good in this genre it reached different people and it showed them what this is like so
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So um, I think that like I don't know that I necessarily expect this to win. I don't know if I think it's a lock for anything. I think probably best makeup and hairstyling would probably be the one that I would think it would be most likely to win if it were to win anything. But I don't think any of the nominations are bad ones either. And best makeup and hairstyling, it's got a lot of competition. Let's see, where was that category? Because it's also got Wicked and Nosferatu and Emilia Perez and A Different Man, which I have not yet seen, but I have seen at least some bits of it that suggest it does have quite a bit of elaborate makeup stuff in it. Um, yeah, so I think anything else you want to touch on with the
no,
substance? I think I think it is highly recommended for someone who's not squeamish and likes horror movies with a dash of satire. It's great in that regard. If you are squeamish, maybe just like read a Wikipedia summary of it or something, because you're gonna have a hard time otherwise. Or I don't know, maybe just, you use your own best judgment in that regard. So the next in terms of release, actually, when did Wicked release?
is what sorry
I was just double checking. Okay, yeah. So the next in terms of release date is Conclave. Um, Conclave is a movie about um, the inner workings of the Catholic Church in Vatican City, where the Pope in the story has just died, and now all of the cardinals have to get together to do the election for the new Pope. And we primarily follow Rafe Fiennes as Cardinal Lawrence, who is tasked with basically organizing and running the conclave. And he has his preferences for who like he would think should be the next pope. And there's a few contenders who might win to be the next pope that we definitely don't like what they want to do. And it's largely the movie's perspective. Our POV characters are on the more progressive side of that divide. But it's all kind of complicated. And so we have Lawrence, who's trying to have everything run and be fair and to do it properly, but he does have a preference for who he thinks to win, wants to win. And the part of the difficulty is that it seems like maybe the person that he wants to win is not gonna win. And so now there's this pressure to like, well, do you, do you kind of put your thumb on the scale if you feel like there's someone who really would be better? And what level of interference or pressure is appropriate, especially when you know the people who you don't want to have win are also definitely doing that. And it's, you know, it's kind of complicated in that regard. So I don't know. Did you? I thought it was great. I think it's very good. Um, we did offline talk a little bit about the ending, and so we'll get there. We'll talk about that, and so we'll kind of give a more aggressive spoiler warning. I think maybe when we get to there, just because it's potentially something, you know, like it's the end of the movie, and it's also potentially something that could be seen as a bigger spoiler. But do you want to talk just more generally about it first?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, I think like I think again the same thing. I said something to you at the end of it. Like I felt really disappointed at the end of it because I think it does so many things so well. I feel like the ending. I know we're gonna get there, but it did to me undermine so much of like the greatness because it felt a little overworked for to really try to drive home a point that I felt was already there, right? Like I thought the point like of which I think what he's going for is that, you know, if like and this is why I don't think this is an anti-Christian, anti-Catholic film. Like there is some criticism of that. I don't believe that at all because the whole point is that all the favorites are only the favorites because they are have amassed sort of political power,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Pope who comes in, who's kind of unknown and is more does more cares more about the poor and the actual, you know, source material of what they're supposed to be working off of, is the one who rises to the top.
Mm-hmm.
Like I, I feel like at least for me that was a strong enough message without having to be like, oh, and there's also this other thing that
Mm-hmm.
makes him like different that's going to undermine the church. And it's like because it wasn't really undermining the
Well,
church, like it
I
was saying it was getting the
yeah.
church back to what the church is supposed to be,
Mm-hmm.
and saying these political machinations are not what the church is supposed to be, you know.
Yeah,
That's
I
just how I. Yeah.
sure no, and I can understand that that read for sure. I think that like for one, it's got a lot of really incredible performances and just the visual look of this
Incredible
movie. Like
performances,
got
incredible
Stanley
cinematography.
Tucci, John Lithgow, Ray Fiennes. I don't remember the name of the actor who played Tedesco, but he's he's great. Um, just everything that you know. There's such rich imagery to be used there. I mean, because the conclave itself, like where all the voting happens, is literally the Sistine Chapel. If people don't
Sistine
know that,
Chapel, yeah.
it's like that's literally the Sistine Chapel is where they have it. And so that means that much of the movie takes place not merely in in and around the Sistine Chapel, but also like some of like the back rooms where the cardinals' quarters are and stuff that you wouldn't ever get to see like as a tourist. Um,
Those aren't. That's not. That part isn't real. Like he made that
well,
stuff up.
yeah, I mean, I have to imagine that whatever those are
There's
really
some
like
liberties
are,
there,
yeah.
but the
I'm just
point,
saying
what
like
I
it's speculative, but the point is that like you know, yeah. So I'm not. I didn't mean to suggest that those are the real places that they filmed.
no, and I wasn't trying to diminish
Yeah.
your point because I was actually going to support your point in that you're filming in the Sistine Chapel and you know ostensibly what's around there,
Hmm.
and the movie does a great job of capturing what it's supposed to be about, right? Which is the imagery and the pageantry and the like richness of like why this is important, right?
Hmm.
While having this sort of undercurrent of like all these political machinations, like the dichotomy between the beauty of the church setting and what it's supposed to be
Hmm.
versus what how these guys are kind of acting and how some are like you said more on the like more political machinations versus like Ray Fiennes is a great like you know intermediary in this where like He
Mm-hmm.
understands why this is kind of how it is. He's sort of frustrated with it, but he
Yeah.
also wants to get things done. He's kind of,
Mm-hmm.
he wants to accomplish the job he's been given. He
Mm-hmm.
wants to do it the right way. He wants to have the best possible leader when he kind of leaves this post.
Mm-hmm.
And then people, like I said, on different extremes, like the way it kind of weaves that tapestry is really, really good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And without necessarily getting into the details of it yet, I think that, well, okay, so let's just go ahead and say we're talking about the spoilers about the ending now, and I'm not necessarily jumping right back to like the big shocking detail or whatever, but just the conceptually the ending. I think that it's a lesser film if it just ends with Benito. Is it Benito Benitez? I don't remember now, but if it just ends with, oh, this guy is great, he's actually perfect, and he just gets elected to be Pope, and then it's a happy ending, and it just, I feel like that's a lesser movie because lets, it sort of presents the situation as though somehow, inevitably, God will work his will and the right person will get elected, and it's just that simple. You know what I mean? Like there was a lot of mess, but the right thing happened in the end, and it suggests that somehow like good will always prevail, and it's just like, and it will happen as it's meant to, right? And I don't think that's the story that the movie's trying to tell. I think that it's not suggesting that, I don't think the movie is saying that he should not be Pope. But what is revealed would certainly be something that, if it were known, he would not have been elected Pope. And so that's the dilemma. Not, I think, that he shouldn't be Pope, but that it creates the difficulty in feeling like, I want the whole process to be fair and unbalanced, but I also want the person that I like to win. And what if the only way for the person I like to win is to withhold information from people who would use it against him otherwise? And then it's sort of extra fraught because it only kind of actually comes out to our main character after the fact, meaning the election has already happened. But it was kind of a slow burn, like he was doing some checking on stuff throughout, and then he only discovers at the end. And so, like, I will say the actual details of what the issue is, and people might know this. I had in fact, had this detail spoiled for me before I saw the movie. I didn't actually know exactly how it happened, but I knew like the basic of it, like the sort of the headline version of people who would be scandalized by this ending, that sort of thing. Uh, and I think that I could find some minor fault with the movie in the sense that it is introducing a potentially fraught, controversial subject without really wanting to make the story be about that, right? And I wouldn't say that it has to be about that in order for that to happen in the story. But it's kind of doing it halfway, right? It's one thing to say you just have a character and the story is not about that piece of them. They just happen, you know. So to just stop dancing around it, what we discover is that the person who gets elected pope by the end is intersex, meaning they were born biologically with some they have appear physically male but also have inside ovaries, right? So like that's a real thing that can happen to people. It's like it's intersex people exist, and so you can have a story that has intersex people in it without the movie having to be about that. but it's also like, if you want that to be the climactic reveal about them, I don't know that the movie necessarily handles it especially deftly. I don't want to overstate that, because I didn't think it was bad. I didn't think it was disrespectful. Because to be sure, I believe, and I think it's the movie's perspective, that we're not meant to think any less of that character at all.
No, I agree.
But certainly, I think that it is just used as kind of an example of something to set up what the real intended dilemma is for our main character to realize, I was so happy with who we managed to get elected Pope. And part of that in his head was, and I didn't have to keep any secrets or do anything wrong. It all just happened. It just worked like it's supposed to. Only to have it then be revealed that it's actually more complicated than that. That in the same way that several of the other people that he didn't want to have elected Pope ended up losing votes because something came out about them, right? We discover, oh, this guy actually had an affair that produced a daughter 30 years ago. Now nobody will vote for him. This other person literally bribing other cardinals to vote for him. Not cool, right? Bad. But the whole thing is like they end up taken out of the running because these secrets come out about them. And so to finally get to this guy, Benito, at the end is like, oh, he's great. But then you realize, in the same way that we cheered when a secret was revealed about the guys that we didn't like and that took them out of the running, this is absolutely a secret that even if we don't think it should have taken him out of the running, we can still know for a fact that it would have. And further, that it still could. And then what? Right? And so I think that is the dilemma that it wants to land on. And the intersex status of the character in question it's really just like, it almost could have been anything, right? It happens to be that, but it's not really about that. And so I think that's where maybe it rubs some people a little bit the wrong way.
Yeah, I like I said, it doesn't really rub me the wrong way. I agree with everything you're saying. I felt like it, because it could have been anything. Like it felt just the way it's revealed, not the fact of what it is, right? Like it makes it feel like this like sort of gotcha moment of like, I don't know. It just, like you said, maybe it wasn't handled as deftly as it could have been.
I think there is an element where they're kind of going for shock value a little bit.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think in some ways that's a little bit realistic, just because it's kind of reflective of the fact that despite how common it is actually in real life, most people don't know anything about it, because generally speaking in the world, we don't talk about it very much.
Yeah.
There are way more intersex people than most people think. That's not to say that it's a high percentage of the population, but it's more than you'd think, especially given that most people have never even heard of that as something that can happen. It's because when it does, it's, something that society often teaches us to think should be a deeply held secret and not public conversation, And so I think to some extent, like, it kind of plays into it that way. But at the same time, I think ultimately, like, to evoke it, especially in a way where our main character is very shocked upon discovering it, isn't maybe the best way to approach the issue, but it's also not really about that. But then I think you could also, like we were just saying, is like you could potentially say, well, but if it's not going to be about that, then it could have been something else. So, but then again, I don't know. I mean, in some respects, like one of the themes running throughout was that some of the progressive voices were saying that, like, well, we should be reevaluating what the role of women in the church is, right? And you have Isabella Rossellini's character, like, who's not, like, per the rules, isn't really supposed to be doing anything, and yet she's running around in the background accomplishing a lot of stuff, right?
Yeah,
And
she was
so,
great. Yeah.
yeah. And so that's, I mean, I think maybe it kind of dovetails into there, but I don't know that that piece of it is necessarily as successful. But it's a great movie. People should watch it, I think.
I agree. Like I'm that's what I'm saying. Like I think I'm just disappointed with how it landed because of how much I enjoyed how it got there,
Hmm.
right? And I don't have any of the like the general. I think we've kind of got through it, right? Like I'm
Hmm.
not like offended by it or anything. Like it's all fine. It just it it felt like it took something that wove together so well, and then we're just
Hmm.
like, ha, and then
A
there's
little
this
bit
drop
messy at
out.
the ending for how not messy it is throughout.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think I think that's what disappointed me is that
Hmm.
it just didn't quite land where I would have loved for it to.
Hmm.
Um, but yes, it's still phenomenal.
Yeah.
Like still definitely worth watching.
All
But
right. Oh,
yeah, this was one that where when my wife watched it with me, she wasn't like, "Oh, I've been thinking about this movie for a few days." It was like, "Wait," because it kind of just it comes so fast, right? And she's like,
hmm.
"Wait, so wait, what? This is what happened?" I was like, "Yeah." She's like, "Okay, that's weird," like, and not like it's wrong or this is
Hmm.
bad. It's just kind of like, oh, okay,
It yeah.
they're just coming out of the
Within the
blue.
context of the movie, it kind of comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
but anyway,
So,
um,
oh yeah.
I don't know. Is it possible to wrap it up there for this time?
Well, okay. I mean, I think the other movie that we were going to touch on would be Wicked, but we can perhaps leave that one for next time.
I think how long of our discussion would be on Wicked and or whether we
Well, I think Wicked is probably the most seen of the four at this point, and so I don't know that I think we could maybe keep it high level unless we like if we feel like we don't get as much discussion of it as we want, we could always do more later.
good with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I thought that this was a very successful presentation of the first half of the Wicked musical, and they're going to have a hard time when it comes to part two because it's a downer compared to Act One. And this is something I've kind of always said about Wicked as soon as I heard they were splitting it into two parts. I was kind of like, well, but instead of having like a natural arc over the course of an evening, now you're going to have a happy, fun one and then a sad downer one. Okay. But this is the happy fun part, and it is happy and fun, and I liked it. Performances are great. I think where it's been criticized, it's that some of this, like the cinematography, is maybe like some of the cinematography and staging is not all that it perhaps could have been. But you've got such a great source material and such great performances that it's fine. It's still good.
Yeah, that's an interesting take that I hadn't considered because, like you said, it's normally over the course of an evening,
Mm-hmm.
and I've always liked the second half better,
Hmm.
not because it's a downer, but I love the creativity of where it really
Mm-hmm.
starts to weave itself into the original
Yeah.
Wizard of Oz
Mm-hmm.
story and how it sort of like chips away at like some of the things that like are canon,
Yeah.
right?
Right. It
And
it basically spins the original version of the story as the propaganda version.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've always found that incredibly
Oh yeah.
creative and interesting, and so that's my I enjoy that
Sure.
part more. Yeah,
Yeah. And just to clarify, it's not that I think the second half is bad. I think it's just tonally so different that when you have people buy tickets for the first one and it's so bubbly and fun and crowd pleasing, that's kind of not really the vibe of the second half. which is also good but different. And it's one thing if you just go and you have a snack and you go to the bathroom and then you come back in 15 minutes after the intermission and it's all part of the same evening. It's another thing for a year later to buy a whole separate ticket for.
Yeah, I'm agreeing
Oh,
with
yeah.
your take. I just
Well,
hadn't thought of it,
yeah.
you know.
So we'll see. I don't know. Maybe they've got ideas for how to do that, because certainly they've already made just half of the musical into a relatively long movie, and so they maybe have all sorts of expansions that they're planning to do on it. I'm kind of hoping it isn't just by adding a whole bunch of Hobbit style fight sequences, um, but we'll see, I guess. But boy, that hesitation aside, um, just what fun! This is a good musical, has great songs in it. You know, we touched on a little bit. It's like there's no best original song nominations because all of these songs are great, but not original songs because they're in a musical from years back. So, but you know, Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande are both fantastic in their roles. I really like the guy who plays Fiero. He really he sells most of what he has to do extremely well, but there is just one particular bit where Elphaba says, like, well, that's why you're so sad. And just little bits of facial expression stuff that he does there are both really good, and also the sort of thing that it's hard to do in a live stage musical because you're not right there close up on the face.
Yes. That's a great example of one of the things that I felt like was really effective about this is that
Mm-hmm.
it took the different medium and really leaned into it, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there is some staging that's pretty cool, right? That you couldn't do in a stage projection.
Mm-hmm.
There's some close-ups and emotion of like what these people are going through
Mm-hmm.
are so critical to the story that can now be more subtle as opposed to just sort of stated like in the play
Yeah,
or just assumed, you know. I and but yeah, at the end of the day, it's just a lot of fun.
it is. It is. It's so much fun. Shoot. One little note that I'd like to shout out, because this is something that a lot of people might not pick up on unless you already knew who these people were. But when they go to the Emerald City and they get that, there's that song where these two other actresses come in to do like the history of the Emerald City and the Wizard, and they're kind of like competing against each other. That's the original Broadway cast. That's the original Broadway Elphaba and Glinda. Galinda, I guess, because that's a whole thing. If people don't know this musical, is it Galinda or is it Glinda? It's weird. But anyway, but yeah, so I think it's enormous fun to watch that sequence, knowing that is the Elphaba and Glinda from the Broadway cast. And so for this movie to honor and respect the originators of the role by giving them a fun number where they get to sing and they get to sort of spar with their counterparts and that sort of thing. It's great. I love that about it.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool too.
Mm-hmm.
So
Idina Menzel and Kristen Chenoweth are the actresses. Idina Menzel is the one who got misnamed by John Travolta at the Oscars one year, where he introduced her getting ready to sing a song by calling her the wickedly talented Adele Dazeem. And everyone was just like, what? That's not her name. Where did that come from?
right.
But yes, so she's actually done a lot of stuff. She's the voice of Elsa in Frozen, for example. And oddly enough, in Enchanted, which is a musical, she is in it as the other woman who doesn't get to sing, which is a bizarre choice, but sure, why not? Anyway, Wicked is great. People, you know if you want to see it or not. If you did, you probably saw it already, and otherwise, it's good. It's probably going to win some things. I don't think it'll win Best Picture.
No.
But we'll see. But yeah, just to sum up, so it had Best Picture, and Um, scrolling down, scrolling down. Best original score, because I guess they did write some new music for it. Best production design, costume design, makeup and hairstyling, sound, and visual effects. Oh, and editing. So, yeah, I got a bunch of nominations. 10. Tied for second most nominations with The Brutalist. All right, so I think we'll leave it there then, and we'll come back for another update, hopefully, before the big ceremony and talk about more movies. And in the meantime, everybody, watch good movies.
Oh, watch good movies.